When I built a small shooting range on my own land, I thought it was my dream come true. But the HOA had other plans. They tore it down without warning. They thought they had won, but they had no idea who they were messing with. I had always dreamed of living somewhere peaceful, after retiring from the military, a place where I could finally unwind and enjoy my passions without unnecessary interference. So when I found a large property just outside the city, limits with wide open space and thick woods, it felt like fate calling me home. The property technically fell under the jurisdiction of an HOA, but during the buying process, the real estate agent assured me that it was mostly inactive, a relic from earlier days when the area had first been developed. It had some basic rules about lawn maintenance and property appearance, but no one seemed too concerned with enforcement, and most of the community seemed to value privacy and mutual respect over strict regulations. After moving in and spending a few months getting to know my new neighbors, I decided to finally pursue one of my biggest post-retirement dreams, building a personal shooting range on my own land. Shooting had been a lifelong hobby for me, a discipline I had practiced and perfected over decades, and now with no one to answer to, it was time to set up a safe, private space where I could continue practicing in peace. I did not cut corners, either. I hired professional consultants with experience in designing private ranges to help me plan every detail, and we installed state-of-the-art safety barriers, earthen berms, soundproofing walls, and clear signage around the perimeter. Every safety precaution imaginable was taken, and I made sure to position everything well within my own property lines to avoid even the slightest infringement on anyone else's space or rights. When construction began, most of the neighbors were either curious or supportive, stopping by to ask questions or simply watch the work with interest, and a few even expressed excitement, joking about getting free shooting lessons or asking if I would be willing to host friendly competitions. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few people grumbled about noise or bad optics, muttering under their breath at neighborhood barbecues or community events, but no one filed any formal complaints at first, and I figured that as long as I continued being respectful, things would settle down. Unfortunately, I underestimated one person in particular, a woman named Patricia, though everyone in the neighborhood privately referred to her as Karen behind her back. Patricia sat on the HOA board, and she had made it her personal mission to enforce rules as strictly as possible, even in areas where enforcement was shaky or non-existent. As soon as the shooting range construction was finished and I held my first small test session to ensure everything worked correctly, Patricia showed up on my doorstep, fuming, waving a printed copy of the HOA guidelines in my face. She accused me of violating aesthetic standards, damaging the community image, and posing a safety threat to families with children, even though my property was surrounded by dense woods, with no adjacent houses in direct line of fire, and even though I had offered to give safety demonstrations to any concerned neighbors. I tried to be diplomatic, inviting her to visit the range, see the safety measures in place, and even offering to let her sit in on a safety briefing if she had any lingering fears. She refused flatly, declaring that guns had no place in a family neighborhood, and threatening to make this right through the proper channels. I brushed it off at first, assuming that she would grumble and move on, but I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I began receiving passive-aggressive letters from the HOA, citing vague infractions like nuisance creation and excessive construction noise. Even though by then the range was completed and only in light use, each letter became increasingly hostile, culminating in formal notices demanding that I dismantle the range immediately. I consulted local laws and even hired a second legal consultant to ensure I was fully within my rights, and I was reassured that my setup was entirely legal and enforceable as private property use. Armed with that knowledge, I attended an HOA meeting, calmly explained the measures I had taken, provided expert opinions and certifications, and even offered to hold an open safety day for the entire community. Rather than appreciating my efforts at compromise, the HOA board, fueled by Patricia's aggressive lobbying, held an emergency meeting to vote on new regulations that prohibited the operation of shooting ranges or similar firearm-related activities within the community. A rule obviously tailored specifically to target me. Though I contested the fairness and legality of the move, the HOA had the power to amend its rules through a simple majority, and with Patricia stirring up fear-mongering about danger to children and devaluation of property values, they managed to ram the new regulation through. Still, I believe that because my range predated the new rule, and because it was on private land, it would be grandfathered in or protected by state laws about property rights. I continued using my range cautiously, avoiding drawing too much attention, but I remained wary, knowing that Patricia and her cronies were probably looking for any excuse to escalate matters further. Then came the day that still burns in my memory like a scar. I had taken a rare weekend trip to visit family out of town, trusting that nothing could happen in a mere 2 days. When I returned, my stomach dropped at the sight that greeted me. The entire shooting range had been bulldozed into an unrecognizable wasteland of broken barriers, crushed materials, and torn-up earth. Deep tread marks from heavy machinery scored the ground where the berms had once stood proudly. My signs were ripped down, my safety structures smashed, my months of careful planning and labor destroyed in a thoughtless act of bureaucratic violence. As I stood there in stunned silence, a neighbor timidly approached and handed me a folded letter left on my doorstep. It was an official notice from the HOA declaring that they had removed unauthorized structures from my property to maintain community standards, and that any attempts to rebuild would be met with additional fines and possible legal action. I could not believe it. Without even notifying me, without court orders or legal authority, they had trespassed onto my land, hired contractors, and physically destroyed thousands of dollars worth of property. Not to mention countless hours of personal effort and pride. My blood boiled, but more than that, a deep, cold determination began to take root. They had crossed a line they could never uncross, and they would soon learn that I was not a man who accepted defeat lightly. Standing there on the ruins of what had once been my shooting range, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me so intensely it nearly buckled my knees. The sight was gut-wrenching. It was not just the physical destruction that cut deep. It was the sense of violation. The idea that people who had no right had come onto my land and stripped away something I had worked so hard to build. The earth was torn and broken, berms reduced to muddy piles, the soundproof barriers shattered like kindling, every trace of careful craftsmanship obliterated under the heavy tread marks that scarred the ground. Wooden posts, splintered like broken bones, stuck up at odd angles, and the once neatly constructed safety walls had been reduced to twisted metal and torn sheets of insulation. My heart pounded with rage, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles turned white, but underneath that anger was a sinking, hollow feeling of helplessness. For the first time since I had left the military, I felt powerless in the face of an enemy that hid behind fake smiles and petty regulations instead of uniforms and rifles. That night, I barely slept, pacing the floor of my living room, staring at the ruins through the window, replaying every conversation with the HOA in my mind, wondering how it had come to this. The next morning, with adrenaline still burning through my veins, I made the first smart move in this entire mess. I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. A bulldog of a man who had spent decades beating corrupt homeowner associations at their own game. After hearing my story and inspecting the site himself, he shook his head in disbelief and assured me that the HOA had gone way beyond their legal authority. They had committed blatant trespassing, destruction of private property, and possibly even criminal mischief under state law. We had a case, and a strong one at that. Without wasting time, we filed a lawsuit against the HOA, citing multiple violations, seeking damages for the destruction of my range, compensation for emotional distress, and punitive damages to make an example out of them. At first, I thought this would be the beginning of a swift victory. I imagined that once the HOA realized the gravity of what they had done, they would fold under pressure, offer a settlement, and slink away in shame. I underestimated them again. Instead of accepting responsibility, the HOA lawyered up with a high-powered firm that specialized in burying people like me in endless legal proceedings. They filed motion after motion, dragging out the process, delaying court dates, requesting ridiculous amounts of documentation, trying to exhaust me financially and emotionally. Meanwhile, they turned up the pressure in other ways. I began receiving outrageous fines in the mail, citing me for property damage caused by the unauthorized structure, for landscape disruption, and for non-compliance with community standards. Each fine was more ludicrous than the last, sometimes totaling thousands of dollars in a single month. When I protested or tried to argue, they threatened liens against my property. HOA meetings became a circus. The board members would openly mock me during sessions, smirking and making snide comments about cowboys who think they are above the rules, and troublemakers who do not understand community spirit. Patricia, in particular, relished every moment, smiling smugly from her seat at the head of the table as if she had already won. They flaunted their power without shame, knowing they controlled the HOA funds, the rules, and the community narrative. The worst part was realizing that traditional methods were not going to be enough to beat them. The HOA had deep pockets, fueled by dues collected from hundreds of residents, and they had entrenched themselves deeply into the local political and legal scene. Judges who lived in HOA communities, lawyers who served on HOA boards elsewhere, contractors who did regular business with them, they had connections everywhere. Even if I won the lawsuit eventually, it could take years and tens of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee that the board members personally would face any real consequences. They had insulated themselves behind the corporation that was the HOA, hiding behind layers of bureaucracy. It was a rigged game, and I needed a different plan if I wanted to beat them. As I dug deeper, fueled by sleepless nights and a growing obsession with dismantling the people who had wronged me, I stumbled across a little-known fact that changed everything. The HOA, like many others, was legally organized as a non-profit corporation. It was not a government entity, no matter how much power they wielded or how official their titles sounded. It was a corporation owned by its members, and those members, the homeowners, technically had the right to vote on major decisions, including replacing the board of directors. Even more interestingly, if enough voting rights were gathered, either through ownership of properties or proxy votes, the HOA could be effectively bought out from the inside. It was a long shot, complicated and expensive, but it was possible. That was when a new plan began forming in my mind, one far more ambitious than just winning a court case or forcing a settlement. I realized I did not just want financial compensation. I did not just want an apology. I wanted control. I wanted the ability to dismantle the very system that had empowered these petty tyrants to ruin lives. The idea became an obsession. Every spare moment I had was spent researching HOA laws, corporate governance rules, and voting procedures. I mapped out the community, listing every property, tracking down owners, identifying weaknesses in the current board's support base. I realized that many residents were just as fed up as I was, tired of constant fines, arbitrary rule changes, and power-hungry board members. If I could rally them to my side, if I could buy up properties under the radar or secure enough proxy votes, I could engineer a hostile takeover from within. It would not be easy. The board would fight back viciously, using every dirty trick they could think of, but I was prepared to play the long game. Revenge was no longer just a dream or a fantasy. It was a mission, and I intended to see it through to the end. The first step in my plan to take over the HOA was gathering intelligence, and I approached it like any military operation, moving quietly and methodically to avoid tipping off the enemy. I began reaching out to my neighbors one by one, carefully selecting those who seemed disillusioned with the HOA's reign of terror. Many were easy to spot, homeowners who had received ridiculous fines for things like planting the wrong type of flowers or leaving trash cans out a few hours too long. Others were harder to read, but once I initiated private conversations, I found that resentment against the board ran much deeper than I had imagined. People were tired of being treated like criminals in their own homes, tired of the arbitrary enforcement of rules, and tired of the condescending attitudes of the board members, especially Patricia. Some were afraid to speak out publicly for fear of retaliation, but behind closed doors, they were more than willing to listen to what I had to offer. I did not reveal my full plan at first. I framed it as a general discussion about rights, fairness, and taking back our community from a handful of power-hungry busybodies. The more I listened to their stories, the more determined I became to see this through to the end. While building my network of allies, I also began looking for weak points in the HOA's structure that I could exploit, and I found a goldmine in the form of delinquent properties. Like many HOAs, ours had a number of homes with unpaid dues, liens, or owners who had simply abandoned the property due to foreclosure or financial troubles. These properties were often forgotten by the community at large, but they still carried voting rights within the HOA structure. Quietly and carefully, I began purchasing the debts attached to these properties, acquiring ownership where possible, or at least securing legal proxies that gave me control over their votes. In some cases, I set up shell LLCs to prevent the board from noticing that one person was suddenly acquiring influence. It was slow, tedious work, involving endless paperwork and negotiations, but every property I gained was another brick in the foundation of my takeover. Along the way, I uncovered a number of shady tactics the HOA had used to maintain their grip on power. They selectively enforced rules against enemies while ignoring violations by their friends. They manipulated meeting times and notifications to minimize attendance from dissenters. They used fines and threats of foreclosure to scare homeowners into submission. All of this worked in my favor, fueling the anger and resentment that made my recruitment efforts even easier. After months of careful preparation, I finally had the numbers I needed to force a special election. According to the HOA's own bylaws, if a certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition demanding a vote, the board would be legally required to hold one. With my voting block solidified and the petition ready, I launched the next phase of my plan. I organized a secret campaign, spreading the word quietly through trusted allies, handing out flyers discreetly, and holding meetings at my house where we could strategize without fear of spies. The key was maintaining secrecy until the petition was filed. If the board caught wind of what we were doing too early, they could attempt to change the rules, disqualify signatures, or otherwise sabotage the effort. Tension ran high during those weeks. Every time I saw a board member driving through the neighborhood, I worried that they were onto us. Every knock on the door made my heart race with the fear that someone had betrayed us. But we stayed disciplined, and when the day came to submit the petition, we did it all at once, blindsiding the board with a tidal wave of signatures they could not ignore. The board tried every trick in the book to stop the special election from happening. They challenged the validity of signatures, claiming that some homeowners had been coerced or misinformed. They tried to change the election rules mid-process, proposing emergency amendments to the bylaws that would raise the threshold for a vote. They even attempted to hold closed-door meetings to disqualify certain votes on technicalities. But we had anticipated these moves, and my lawyer was ready with countersuits and legal threats that kept them in check. Every dirty tactic they used only strengthened our resolve, making it clear to even the most skeptical homeowners that the board was desperate to cling to power at any cost. The final week before the election was the most nerve-wracking of my life. Flyers smearing my name began appearing around the neighborhood, accusing me of wanting to destroy community values and turn the neighborhood into a war zone. Anonymous emails circulated, spreading lies about my background, my family, even my military service. It was ugly, but I kept my focus on the mission. We had come too far to turn back now. The night of the election, the community center was packed to the brim, the air thick with tension and barely concealed hostility. Board members sat stiffly at the front table, their faces pale and strained, while residents filled every available seat, many standing in the back or lining the walls. As the votes were cast, you could feel the shift in the room, a silent current of rebellion that no smear campaign could extinguish. When the final tally was read aloud, it was not even close. We had won by a landslide, more than enough votes to remove the entire board from office immediately. For a moment, there was stunned silence, as if people could not quite believe it had actually happened. Then the room erupted in cheers, and the board members, faces flushed with humiliation and barely concealed rage, gathered their belongings and left without a word. Patricia paused at the door, turning to glare at me one last time, but I met her gaze without blinking, until she turned away and disappeared into the night. After the dust settled, the residents unanimously voted to appoint me as the new president of the HOA, a position I had not originally sought but accepted with pride and a sense of duty. I stood before my neighbors, humbled by their trust, and promised that things were going to change, not just for me but for everyone who had suffered under the board's tyranny. For the first time, in a long time, I felt a sense of real community, not based on rules and regulations, but on mutual respect and a shared desire to live free. But the fight was not over yet. Winning the election was just the beginning. Now it was time to make things right, to clean house, to rebuild not just my shooting range but the very spirit of the neighborhood itself. And I intended to do it thoroughly, methodically, and without mercy for those who had abused their power for so long. Taking control of the HOA was just the beginning, because now it was time for justice, real justice, not the kind handed down through rigged votes and whispered threats, but the kind that left no stone unturned and no guilty party unpunished. My first official act as the newly elected president of the HOA was to convene an emergency meeting, open to all homeowners, where I outlined a list of immediate changes. At the top of the list was the termination of every single staff member, contractor, and advisor who had been involved in the illegal demolition of my shooting range. Their services were no longer required, and for some, I made sure termination letters were hand-delivered by process servers right in the middle of their lunch breaks. Watching their stunned faces as they realized they had lost their cushy HOA-funded jobs was a delicious moment, one I savored as the first real step toward cleansing the rot that had infected our community. But firing them was not enough. I needed to uncover the full extent of their corruption to make sure they could never worm their way back into positions of power elsewhere. So, with the support of the new board, we launched a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, hiring a third-party accounting firm with a reputation for ruthlessness. It did not take long for the skeletons to start tumbling out of the closet. The audit revealed years of financial mismanagement, missing funds, unauthorized expenditures, and outright embezzlement. Patricia and several of her allies had been siphoning off money through inflated maintenance contracts, bogus consulting fees, and sweetheart deals with friends and relatives. Tens of thousands of dollars that should have gone toward community improvements had instead lined the pockets of the very people who had pretended to stand for neighborhood pride and integrity. Armed with this mountain of evidence, I wasted no time in handing it over to the appropriate authorities, including the state's attorney general's office and the local district attorney. Investigations were opened, subpoenas were issued, and before long, several ex-board members found themselves facing criminal charges, ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit property destruction. Some tried to plead ignorance, others blamed each other, but the evidence was ironclad, and as news of the scandal spread, their reputations were shredded beyond repair. Watching Patricia being led out of her home in handcuffs was a sight I would cherish for the rest of my life, a visual reminder that sometimes the good guys do win after all. With the old regime dismantled and justice well underway, I turned my attention to rebuilding what had been lost. The shooting range had been more than a hobby for me. It was a symbol of freedom, a personal sanctuary, and it deserved to be reborn bigger and better than ever. I hired the best contractors in the region, specialists in private range construction, and together we designed a facility that exceeded anything I had ever dreamed of. Higher, thicker berms, top-of-the-line soundproofing, automated target systems, and a covered shooting pavilion that could withstand the harshest weather. No expense was spared, and every improvement was funded legally, openly, and proudly, with full community approval. Once construction was complete, I hosted an open house for the entire neighborhood, inviting everyone to come see the range for themselves, to understand the level of care and professionalism that had gone into its creation. We grilled burgers, played music, gave safety demonstrations, and offered free shooting lessons under close supervision. Even former skeptics who had once muttered about danger and eyesores left with smiles on their faces, many of them asking if they could sign up for regular training sessions. But I did not stop there. To ensure that no future HOA board could ever again trample the rights of homeowners under the guise of community standards, I spearheaded a comprehensive overhaul of the HOA bylaws. We stripped away the most oppressive and vague regulations, replacing them with clear, simple rules focused solely on true safety and basic neighborhood upkeep. No more nitpicking about the color of mailboxes or the length of grass. No more secret fines or backroom rule changes. Most importantly, we enshrined a homeowner's Bill of Rights, guaranteeing freedoms like property usage, protection from arbitrary fines, and the right to defend one's property from unreasonable HOA actions. It was a radical change, and it turned our neighborhood from a place of quiet resentment into a vibrant, proud community, where neighbors trusted each other instead of living in fear of clipboard-wielding tyrants. Word of what had happened spread quickly, first through the county, then through the state, and eventually beyond. Local news stations ran segments titled, "The Man Who Bought the HOA," and "Veteran Wins Battle Against OA Bullies," and I found myself receiving emails and letters from strangers across the country, thanking me for standing up and asking for advice on how they could fight back in their own communities. I became, much to my surprise, something of a local legend, a symbol of what could happen when one person refused to be bullied into submission. I never sought fame, but I embraced the opportunity to help others, sharing my story at town halls, online forums, and even participating in legislative discussions about HOA reform at the state level. Every time I saw a homeowner stand a little taller, every time I heard someone say they were fighting back against injustice in their own neighborhood, it reminded me why the fight had been worth it. Looking back, the experience taught me more than I ever expected. It taught me that bullies do not always wear obvious uniforms, that sometimes they hide behind polite smiles and bureaucratic jargon. It taught me that the system, corrupt and stacked though it often is, can still be beaten if you are willing to outwork, outthink, and outlast your enemies. Most of all, it taught me that freedom is never something you can take for granted. You have to defend it, tooth and nail, against anyone who tries to chip it away, no matter how small the battle may seem. I had fought for freedom overseas, and I found that fight again right here at home, in the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood that nearly became a petty dictatorship. But not on my watch. Never on my watch. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the day my new shooting range officially reopened, I stood at the firing line, the smell of fresh wood and new paint still hanging in the air. Neighbors gathered behind me, laughing and chatting, enjoying the festivities, a true community reborn through fire and determination. I loaded my rifle, chambered a round, and fired a crisp, perfect shot into the heart of a steel target downrange. The sharp clang echoed across the property, not as a sound of violence, but as a celebration, a declaration of victory. I lowered the rifle, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure wash over me. Smiling to myself, I looked around at the land I had fought so hard to protect, at the people who had stood by my side, and at the future we had reclaimed together. Freedom was not given, it was earned, and I had earned it with every battle fought, every wrong righted, and every single shot fired in the name of justice.